Over the last 6 months, this lens right here has had a major impact on my photography, and that's the 40mm. So in today's video, I want to share a bunch of example photos shot at 40mm while I was in Japan, here in Australia, Brazil, and back home in New Zealand. And there's always been this big debate about what's the best focal length between the 35 and the 50mm prime lens. And I've recently found 40mm is the best focal length, and today I'm going to tell you why. So when I started photography, I did what I'm assuming most people do, and that's to build out an arsenal of lenses to cover all of the possible focal lengths that I might need when going out to take photos for client jobs, for travel, and of course, portraits. And this range of focal lengths didn't really improve my photography, but it did result in back and neck pain from my extremely heavy camera bag. And with this wide range of lenses, something frustrated me about my images. And I found I was using wider focal lengths like the 24mm to add visual interest into my photos with perspective distortion. Or I was using a longer focal length like the 85 or the 70-200 to add that compression to my photos. Because I thought what makes an interesting image is having that interesting perspective. Where I've now realized that using a focal length at the more neutral field of view means you really have to focus on an actual interesting image or scene rather than using a dramatic perspective. Now I still use and will continue to use wider and tighter focal lengths, but it's now with an actual purpose, and that's something I'll expand on a little bit later in today's video. It's actually impressive how versatile the 40mm focal length is. I've used it for portraits, landscapes, and street photography with little to no consideration about changing lenses. And if you think about this, what's the focal length between the popular and versatile 35 and 50mm? Well, of course, it is the 40mm. So if you enjoy using 35 and the 50mm lens, then consider that the 40mm is the best of both worlds. You get that wider field of view like the 35mm, and you get that similar compression to the 50mm. And that's where I fit in, as I always found that 35mm was just a little bit too wide but not wide enough, while the 50mm was always just a little bit too tight. 40mm is also the closest focal length to how our eyes see the world, that being a 42mm in full frame field of view. And this statement has always kind of annoyed me, as you can't really compare a camera's field of view to our eyes. You know, we have two eyes that overlap. We actually see a much wider field of view because of our peripheral vision. But the key to this is that the compression is the same. So the relative distance of objects of the 40mm focal length is similar to what our eyes see, which can be seen as a great advantage because it makes it easy to find compositions and interesting scenes. Another great concept is that the 40mm prime lens is available as a compact lens from a variety of camera and third-party manufacturers. And I've been using this 40mm f2.5 G lens from Sony on my A7 IV. And I'm not only happy with the performance of this lens, but also the price and the size of this lens. This lens is sharp and it handles flares extremely well in backlit situations. The bokeh is nice and smooth, and the autofocus is just fantastic paired with the Sony A7 IV. Now, the profile corrections of this lens are actually quite aggressive due to the distortion, but that's what you expect from a compact prime lens. I also bought this super popular 27mm f2.8 pancake lens from Fujifilm. And this will give you a 40mm after the 1.5 times crop factor. Now, this lens definitely isn't as good as my Sony, but it is a lens packed with character. The bokeh is actually quite poor, with the out of focus elements being very distracting when shot at f2.8. The autofocus is loud, slow, and quite inaccurate at times. And this lens suffers from a horrible rainbow flare from bright sources of light. But it's incredibly light and compact, affordable but not accessible, as it's always sold out. And if you are a Fuji user, I do recommend this lens as it's super fun, and I wouldn't recommend this cheaper alternative from TT Artisan. So these slower aperture lenses are not really ideal for portraits. So I did actually pick up this absolute beast of a lens, the 27mm f1.2 Viltrox, that will pair well with my Fujifilm X-T5 when it arrives. I'm really looking forward to test that combination out for portraits while I'm in South Korea next month. So if you're interested in that, make sure you subscribe. And if you like the way that I edit my photos and you want to emulate this pastel film look, check out my presets, which are linked down below. One of the few limitations of the 40mm is that it's too niche, meaning that there isn't that many lens options to buy when compared to, say, the 35 and the 50mm, which you can purchase in multiple different sizes, aperture ranges, and also meet your budget requirements. Also, if you're using a zoom lens like the 24-70, it's hard to find where that focal range of 40mm is. So you do really need to own a 40mm prime lens to test out this focal length. And finally, no focal length is perfect, and the 40mm is no exception to this. So you should always have a wider focal length to establish the scene or the location, and a tighter lens for that compressed, detailed look to be able to tell a story with photography. So if this video has provided you with any value today, make sure you click that like button and consider subscribing for future videos. I have a wedding tomorrow, so I better start packing my camera bag. So subscribe and we'll see you next week.